In the heart of Lagos, the Johnson family was considered the perfect middle-class household. Mr. Johnson, a civil engineer, was always busy supervising construction sites, while Mrs. Johnson managed a boutique in Ikeja. Their two children, 10-year-old Dara and 8-year-old Toby, were cheerful and full of energy, but their mischievous ways often left the house in chaos. Unable to juggle their busy schedules and the children, the Johnsons decided to hire a house girl. Cynthia came highly recommended by Mrs. Johnson's distant cousin. She was a young woman in her early 20s, with soft-spoken words, humble attire, and a downcast demeanor that immediately earned her sympathy. "She seems perfect," Mrs. Johnson said after their first meeting. Mr. Johnson nodded in agreement, though his glance lingered a bit too long on Cynthia's slim figure. At first, Cynthia was everything the Johnsons hoped for. She cooked delicious meals, kept the house spotless, and managed the children's antics with a calm efficiency that amazed even Mrs. Johnson. Dara and Toby adored her, calling her Sissy Cynthia. But Cynthia's past was a storm cloud she carried silently. She had grown up in extreme poverty, watching her mother work as a housemaid for a cruel employer who belittled her daily. Cynthia vowed never to live a life of servitude without retribution. Beneath her quiet demeanor burned resentment, and she saw the Johnsons as just another version of the oppressors she despised. Her first act of malice was small. She added extra salt to Mr. Johnson's soup, just enough to ruin the meal but not enough to arouse suspicion. She smirked as Mrs. Johnson scolded her husband for being too picky. Next, she started spreading subtle lies. "Madam, Oga Johnson had a phone call late last night," she whispered one morning while cleaning the living room. "I didn't hear much, but I think it was a woman." Mrs. Johnson brushed it off at first, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Toby, the ever-curious 8-year-old, began noticing strange things. His favorite toy car went missing, only to reappear broken under Cynthia's bed. A plate of leftover jollof rice, which he'd been saving, disappeared from the fridge. "Mommy, I think Sissy Cynthia took my rice," Toby said one evening. "Toby, don't be silly. Why would she do that?" Mrs. Johnson replied, dismissing him with a pat on the head. But Toby was determined. He started watching Cynthia closely, even sneaking into the kitchen when she thought no one was around. Cynthia's schemes escalated. She began pitting Dara and Toby against each other, whispering to Dara that Toby had said mean things about her. The children, who had been inseparable, started bickering constantly. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson's suspicion of her husband grew. Cynthia continued dropping hints, her lies becoming bolder. One day, Mrs. Johnson found a lipstick stain on Mr. Johnson's shirt, a stain Cynthia had planted. "Who is she, Shegun?" Mrs. Johnson screamed, waving the shirt in his face. "What are you talking about?" Mr. Johnson replied, genuinely confused. Their once happy marriage began to unravel, with constant arguments filling the house. Cynthia would watch from the corner of the room, her lips curling into a sly smile. One evening, Toby decided to follow Cynthia when she went to dispose of trash. Hiding behind a tree, he saw her pull a small vial from her pocket and pour its contents into the stew pot cooling on the veranda. Toby's heart raced as he ran back into the house. "Mommy, Sissy Cynthia is doing something bad to the food." Mrs. Johnson brushed him off again, but this time, Toby's fear was too genuine to ignore. She decided to check the stew herself and found it smelled faintly of bleach. Mrs. Johnson's hands trembled as she confronted Cynthia. "What is this?" Cynthia's mask slipped for a moment, revealing a glimmer of malice. but she quickly composed herself, feigning innocence. "Madam, I don't know what you're talking about." Mrs. Johnson decided to stay silent but resolved to keep a closer eye on Cynthia. The Johnsons' elderly neighbor, Mama Ireti, had been observing Cynthia for weeks. One day, she called Mrs. Johnson over. "Madam Johnson, that girl in your house, she's not who you think she is," Mama Ireti said. She went on to recount how she'd seen Cynthia meeting with a strange man late at night and whispering angrily about the family. "She's planning something bad. Be careful." Mrs. Johnson felt a chill run down her spine. She decided to search Cynthia's room while she was out. Inside Cynthia's room, Mrs. Johnson found a small notebook filled with hateful scribbles. "They think they are better than me. I'll make them suffer." Alongside the notebook were bottles of bleach, rat poison, and a stack of family photos, some of which had been crossed out with a knife. Mrs. Johnson confronted Cynthia that evening in front of the entire family. Mr. Johnson, initially skeptical, was horrified when he saw the evidence. "You brought this into our home," he shouted, his voice shaking with anger. Cynthia, cornered, finally dropped her facade. "People like you deserve it," she spat. "You think you're better than everyone else because you have money. But you're just as cruel as the rest." Cynthia was handed over to the police. During her interrogation, she confessed to everything, including poisoning the food and trying to create rifts in the family. Her hatred stemmed from her childhood, but it had consumed her entirely. The Johnson family, shaken but grateful to be alive, began the slow process of rebuilding their trust and bond. Mrs. Johnson apologized to her husband for doubting him, and Toby received extra praise for his bravery. Months later, the Johnsons had a new house help, this time thoroughly vetted. The experience left them wiser and closer as a family. As for Cynthia, she was sentenced to several years in prison, left to reflect on the consequences of her actions. The shadows beneath the Johnsons' roof were gone, replaced by light and a renewed sense of gratitude for one another.